I'm an associate professor at the OBHRM department at University of Toronto. Unlike Anita, who is in the strategy department that studies organizations, in OBHRM, we study people in organizations. So we think about people's individual behavior, their psychology, etc. One of the themes that I've gotten from both David's talk and Anita's talk is that to create, you have to break first. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what do you break and how do you break it. So the talk is about hierarchical structure and the creativity. I sort of think about hierarchy very broadly. Any systems that include or is composed of interrelated subsystems are hierarchical structures. And we see those structures around us in the natural world as well as in our social world. Right? In the natural world, the microscopic world, we have hierarchies. Water molecules is composed of atoms, which can be broken down into electrons and nuclears, and then protons and neutrons, etc. In the macro scale, we have galaxies that is composed of star systems, which then we have planets, right? And similarly, in the social world, familiar charts here, organizations, they are very, very hierarchical, right? They start with CEO on the top, managing the VPs, then each managing employees of different functions in different departments. So think about these hierarchical structure and why they are so prevalent in the natural world and in the social world. This is the topic that Herbert Simon, who is one of the greatest management scholar, wanted to explore in 1962, right? So what makes our world, both the natural world and the social world, hierarchical? And he has a very simple point to make. His point is that hierarchical structures are simply more stable. And when applied in the social world, they're simply more efficient. What does that mean? Well, he uses the example of a watchmaking to illustrate the point about the stability of a hierarchical structure. So watches obviously includes lots of parts, right? If you are a famous watchmaker, you probably get a lot of calls that will probably interrupt your work, as any system will receive a lot of interruptions and challenges from the external environment. Now, there are two ways that you can proceed on how to make the watch. One approach is a flat structure where you just assemble all these parts at the same time into the watch. Another approach is hierarchical, right? You first assemble stable subparts, right? And then you put these subparts together. Now think about if you have to receive a lot of phone calls which will interrupt your work every 15 minutes. Which approach is more productive? Of course, the hierarchical approach, right? If you have stable subparts that are assembled, which can later then be put together into the watch, you are much more productive, you are much more efficient, right? So this is the simple idea that is behind the concept of modern manufacturing, right? Nobody assembles anything with all the parts together, right? They always first trying to put together some stable subsystems and then put these subsystems together into the final product. Now that is all great, right? So efficiency is often what people are looking for in organizations. But the question is, what if out of all these small parts, I'm not asking you to make a watch. I'm not asking you to make a familiar product. But instead, I want you to be creative. I want you to create something crazy, to create something that people have never seen before, right? So if that's the case, is a hierarchical structure going to be helpful or going to be harmful? And I think we can't really sort of talk about this question without think about what is creativity, right? There are lots of academic definitions of creativity, but I think what comes down to it, creativity is really about making connections. Steve Jobs put this really well in his quote, creativity is just connecting things when you ask creative people how they did it, they feel a little guilty because they didn't really do it. They just saw something. They just make the connection. They just see the connections. Now, creativity is not just about making any connections. Creativity is about making distal connections, right? It's about linking concepts that you don't normally associate together, right? So an example of making distal connections, we all know that wheels belongs to cars, right? When we think about wheels, usually we think about cars. When we think about chairs, they are furnitures, right? Well, combining these two, we have a wheelchair. We can put wheels on the chair that will provide mobility to people who need them, right? So connecting these distal concepts, one is automobile, the other is furniture, created something new. Now, the process of creating a wheelchair, the process of connecting these distal concepts will be much more difficult if you see them in their respective categories, if you see them in these hierarchical structure, right? This is basically the simplest form of hierarchical structure. You have one level, right? Compared to a flat structure that doesn't have a hierarchical form, right? So, the simple observation here is if you intermix all these concepts without their organizing categories, without their organizing hierarchical structure, the likelihood of making the connection, right, between two concepts that you otherwise would never link them together could be much higher. So this is the simple idea that we wanted to test in experiments since we study people's behavior. What did we do? Well, we asked people to do a Lego task. We give them a box of Legos. The only difference is that in one of the boxes, all the Legos are organized very neatly in categories, right? In other words, they are structured, they are hierarchically structured. They are organized by shape, color, etc. In the other condition, we give them a box of Legos, the exact same Legos, same number, same type of Legos. The only difference is that now they are in a big mess. They're just a box without any categories, without any structure. And we ask them to make an alien figure, something that is not familiar, something is new, and something presumably will use a lot of creativity. This is not an example of what they made, just an illustration. They only had 30 minutes for this task. But after the experiment, we asked 3 independent raters to rate how creative the alien figure that students have created. We also asked them specifically how similar the figures that they created are to the Earth creatures. Right? So, the less similar, the more creative. And what we found is that when students were handed of the box of Legos that are clearly defined, that are clearly structured, they are much less likely to create something that is creative. And we also sort of did another study that instead of playing with Legos, we just gave them a bunch of words. We gave them around 100 words. And in the one condition, these words were broken down into categories, right? So you have categories of words such as clothing or buildings or music. Whereas in the other condition, we give them all the same words, and this time without these guiding categories, without these defining structure. And we again ask these participants or students to simply make sentences. Afterwards, we had PhD students from the linguistic department, and we asked them to rate these sentences and ask them how creative these sentences are. All these raters are blind to hypothesis as well as the conditions. Again, consistent with our Lego study, when students were given these words that is clearly defined by a hierarchical structure, they were much less creative compared to when students were given words that are not organized by these categories or structure. So what does that mean? Well, going back to the theme of creative destruction, there is a Chinese saying which literally translate into break and then create, right? So to create something, you really need to break down the old. And what do you need to break down? Well, certainly there are physical structures, there are physical boundaries that you need to break down. And as we have seen and observed in the past few decades, right, a lot of these physical and the social boundaries has become less popular. Organizations has become much less hierarchical over the time, right? Work teams has been much less hierarchical over the time. What is less obvious is your mental hierarchy, is the categories in your mind, is your habitual way of thinking about things, thinking about concepts, right? Interpreting concepts. These mental barriers, these mental hierarchical structure are probably more difficult to be broken down, right? So, in Anita's talk, the example that the barriers are not often not technology. Right? The barriers are encumbrance, are the established ways of thinking about things, right? So I think, these studies demonstrate that to be creative, you really need to break down your old ways of thinking. How do you do that? Introduce new ways of thinking, right? Instead of assigning your best employee to the job that they do best, give them a different task, right? Give them a different challenge. Instead of, introduce some possibilities of foreign experience. We have research that have shown employees with some experience in a foreign country, even though the exposure may be short, up to 6 months living in a foreign country can significantly increase their creativity, right? So think about what's your goal. If you want to have stability, efficiency, structure is great. But if you want creativity, you want to think again. Thank you very much.